An ordinary street in a quiet Fife town. And here, a memorial to 5 teenage boys who went to see their team play 50 years ago and didn't come home. They were among 66 fans who died in the Ibrox stadium disaster. Their deaths changed this community forever.
All that night we were waiting on the buses, trains coming into the town, hoping and hope that they would come off them. Even at midnight, the last train into Markinch, to no avail, they weren't off it.
I can't remember how I found out, who told me, but the word had started to filter through that the 5 Markinch boys had perished at Ibrox. I was stunned, numb. Just found it unbelievable that that could happen.
It was heartbreaking to be there and seeing the families, seeing the mums, the dads, the grannies, the granddads, and the siblings as well. Seeing them all and knowing that there was nothing you could do which was going to make any difference to them. And I mean, it was a very moving experience, something you wouldn't want anybody to go through.
The events of January 2nd, 1971 shattered lives across Scotland and beyond. This is the story of what happened on Stairway 13. The New Year Old Firm match has long been a fixed point in the Scottish footballing calendar. The country's biggest teams, biggest rivals and biggest crowds. Saturday, January 2nd, 1971 was Rangers' turn to host the match. In Markinch, 5 Rangers fans were travelling to the game that day. They were pals with Shane Fenton and Peter Lee.
Well, we were more or less all brought up together from knee height. They stayed in Park View and we stayed in Park Terrace, which is just a join onto one another. And we were playing football, running about the streets. That friendship just carried on through football and athletics and going to the football and stuff like that. Peter Easton, he always come across to me as a really clever, intelligent kind of boy. Douglas Morrison, he was right into sport. Of the 5 boys, I think Douglas would have been the one that would maybe have went on either to be a football player or an athlete. Ronald Payton, he was football daft. Morning to night, Saturday, Sunday, he'd be across the park on his own, kicking a ball about. Brian Todd, he would probably be the cheekiest of the 5 boys. He'd come to pinching apples and everything. He'd be the instigator, wanting you to jump into the field and that to get the apples. And Mason Fulp, he was a quietish type of boy, kept himself to himself, Mason. He was a good football player as well.
We were all together, just joking, having a wee bit of banter. There was no animosity because they were Rangers supporters, we were Celtic supporters. There was nothing like that. We were pals. Some of that day, you know, I have that in vivid colour, and I've got a strong memory, you know, just up the road there, where we'd met up with the boys, and you know, we'd started walking across to Glenrothes. I've got a really good, clear picture in my head of that. We got on our buses, respective buses in Glenrothes, went through to the game.
In Madison near Falkirk, 18-year-old Margaret Ferguson was hatching a plan to see her favourite team.
Well, my dad wasn't a Rangers supporter, he was a Falkirk supporter, but he had never been to a Celtic and Rangers match. But he knew there were sometimes quite trouble at the games, so he says, you're too young to go to these kind of games. And then that day, she went to my sister's and says, I'm going to the match. And she borrowed money off my sister to go and hid in the pub until it was time for her to go in the bus, and she went in the bus.
For Old Firm fans all over Scotland, the tension was building and the fans flocked to Ibrox.
It was obviously a new year and the family get together, the night before. So probably must have got up late that morning and get ready for the game.
On the match day itself, I went up on the Saturday morning to my flat in Glasgow, got changed, got my scarf, etc., and went off to Ibrox in my usual routine.
It was a very still day. It was a misty, foggy day in Glasgow. It was a subdued day. I mean, this had been New Year, but it had the feeling of a day that people were recovering from New Year rather than still celebrating it.
Not much hinged on that day's match. At the time Celtic were dominant, Rangers were further down the table.
It wasn't a very exciting game, and by the time the end came, the mist was coming down. It was actually difficult to see the far end, and all the excitement, of course, was really crammed into the last couple of minutes of the match.
The game was a nothing game. They talk about Rangers and Celtic games getting the hair going. There just wasn't nothing in it. And then all of a sudden, the last 5 minutes, it exploded.
Gray. Lennox. And that's as near as we'll get it today. And it's a goal, and Johnson has scored.
And then we were lucky enough, we got a free kick and the ball was put in the box. And Colin's team managed to get the equaliser for us, so we were quite happy that we'd drawn the game.
There it is. And Steen, unbelievably, on time, has made it. Rangers 1, Celtic 1.
The Celtic fans must have went away home, sick as parrots, because they thought they'd won the game. We were going home, high as a kite. Even though it was a draw, we taken it as a win to score that equaliser. We were still dancing and jumping on the terrace, and the old boy was out with a stool, an old chair, and taking the nets down before we started to make a move.
Ibrox in 1971 was a very different place to the modern all-seater stadium of today. Much of the ground was uncovered and standing room only. Behind both goals were steep bank terraces where the largest sections of the crowd stood. The home support used the Copeland Road terrace at the east end of the stadium. At the back of this terrace, a concrete wall separated the ground from steep grass banks. There were 2 stairways. The north one was Stairway 13. Being closest to the subway station, it was the busiest of the exits. As the game ended that day and the jubilant home support started spilling out onto Stairway 13, something started to go badly wrong.
I thought I would allow the crush to disperse a bit before I went up to the top of the terracing. So I waited on I thought it was about 5 minutes, but it could have been a minute here or there either way. And then I made my way to the top of the terracing onto the passageway that ran around the top. But I realised I'd made a mistake and the crush was even worse than it usually was at that time.
We managed to get up to the concourse and turn left to head to passageway 13, and it was tight. You felt it. I think I'm past comment to the boys. I say a bit tight today, lads. As soon as we got to the end of the concourse and you were turning right to go down, you knew that this wasn't the norm.
The departing fans were packing into the 7 tight lanes of the staircase. They were heading towards disaster.
The pressure was increasing all the time as you got to the top of the stairway, and more fans were crushing in. And I could see people really in distress, calling out and shouting for people behind, to stop pushing, to get back.
We were absolutely pinned. It was just the pressure of the boys coming behind and off the concourse, and there was a lot of shouting to get back.
Everyone was just being carried along by the crowd, and there was absolutely nothing you could do. And it was really quite a scary feeling. I'd never felt that way before.
It ended up you couldn't even breathe, you couldn't even shout, get back. You thought your lungs were going to pack in, and by this time my legs were wrapped around a boy behind me. My legs were off the ground.
You are absolutely helpless. There's no way you can actually do anything about it. And I was just carried down the stairs along with everybody else. And I think it was about halfway down the stairs, the crush was getting greater and greater. And then suddenly all the people in front of me were just falling away. And there was just a gap in front, and I was falling along with everyone around me, and people behind me were falling on top of me as I fell.
But actually, there was a stage, and it seemed to be, it went on forever. Actually, there was a stage I prayed. I said, please God, don't let me die.
And was it noisy?
No, because you couldn't shout. Because the air was getting squeezed out your lungs, you couldn't shout.
At the height of the incident, hundreds were trapped in a pile on Stairway 13. What was actually happening in the crush? Keith Still is one of the world's leading crowd safety experts.
If you've got a high density crowd moving downstairs, to the level that the eyewitnesses were describing, being pushed against barriers, not having control of your movement, being packed around on all sides, any trip, slip and fall in that environment will result in what we call a cascade dynamic, or the domino effect, where one person falls and falls onto someone else, and obviously with the slope that can then gain momentum. But that only occurs at high density. So the key to these environments is regulating crowd density, but they didn't know that then.
Remember, the stairway ran down from the terrace at the northeast side of the stadium. Nearly 100 steps divided into 5 flights with 4 landings. 6 metal barriers separated the stairway into 7 lanes. On either side of the stairway was a high wooden fence. These were reinforced at the base with concrete. The crush began about 6 minutes after the final whistle. On the left-hand side, as viewed from the bottom of the stairway, between the first and second landings, people fell over and the crush worsened. People started piling on top of each other, and the steel handrails separating lanes 1 and 2 buckled. A police officer described the epicentre of the crush as a diamond shape of bodies, 6 feet high and 15 feet wide. The flow of people in neighbouring lanes continued. Some of those trapped in the crush clambered over the wooden fence at the side. But the fence stayed in place thanks to its concrete reinforced base.
In a crowd that's packed to the levels of density that eyewitnesses were commenting on at Ibrox, and on a slope, then you get the gravitational force added to the fall. And as each person falls onto others, then you get a cascade dynamic. And of course, as soon as that hits steel, well, when flesh and bone meet steel and stone, there can only ever be one winner.
In the heart of the crush, people were struggling to get out.
When we went down, it was quite surreal. There wasn't a lot of noise. And I heard, it was an Irish accent, I heard a boy shouting, heard him saying, keep your head up, son. Keep your head up, wee man, kind of thing. And I didn't care if he was talking to me or talking to somebody else, because I couldn't even turn my head. Then the next thing I could feel was that I felt we were on our side, with the barriers must have been crushing me when out.
So many people were actually trapped so solidly, you know, and some had their arms by their sides, they couldn't move. And I could feel bodies coming down above me, and the pressure getting greater and greater on my legs. And I looked down, and there was a policeman who'd been on duty down at the bottom of the steps, and he was climbing up to see what he could do to help and trying to pull people out. So he came to me and tried to pull me out, but he couldn't pull me, couldn't budge me. And he moved on to try and help others. And by this time I was getting really quite panic-stricken about what was going to happen.
And then you heard folks saying, give me your hand, son, give me your hand. And it was the police and other folk helping everybody out. And I actually thought they were stoning. I said, what are they doing stoning folks' heads? Because I thought I was getting pulled vertically up the way. And I wasn't. What had happened was they were standing on the ground and we had fell there like that. And it was just all heads. And they were pulling them out that way, horizontal. They says, can you walk? And I says, aye. And I stood up and they let me go and I fell down another flight of steps and they had to lift me up and pick me up.
There seemed to be even greater movement above as I suppose more and more fans were coming over the top of the terracing. And the bodies around me seemed to twist, and it twisted me round so that I actually went 180 degrees and was staring up at the sky with my back to the steps. But that somehow seemed to loosen my legs a little bit. And when the policeman next came along, I said to him, he could try pulling me out again. And it's probably easier because I was upside down. He got me under the oxters and just gave a great heave and pulled me out.
What I remember was there was a slight give in front of me. My arms helped lever me up from between the lad behind me and the lad in front of me. And I actually crawled this 2 metres over the fence and fell over the fence onto the grass and embankment. My shoes were gone, my watch was gone, and I was just trying to get my breathing back as I sat high up in the embankment of the grass fields.
As a Celtic fan, Shane Fenton was oblivious to the tragedy that was engulfing his friends from Markinch in the opposite end of the ground.
We stayed at the game till Celtic had scored to go 1-0 up. We thought that was it. We left, we'd been youngsters, to make sure safely back to the bus. We were actually back on the bus about 10-15 minutes before the other older guys came on, and they told us that Rangers had equalised. But at that stage, we never knew of anything happening in Stairway 13 or any incident at the game.
It was very calm, and even when I went down Stairway 19, which had some degree of view, there was metal partitions going down the side of the stairway. But there was still no inkling when I got to the bottom of 19 and walked across to Paisley Road West. People weren't saying, look, there's something wrong, there's something terrible happened here. And in fact, I was probably about half a mile along Paisley Road West when I heard the first ambulance sirens.
The city's hospitals were put on high alert. Ambulances and police from all over Glasgow rushed to the scene. They joined volunteer first aid crews who'd been staffing the match.
That day, I was actually deployed to, at that time, the disabled supporters sat trackside, and I was asked to assist some of them out to their buses. So I was actually out maybe about 10 minutes before the end of the game, assisted them to their bus, come back over, game was finished, most of the crowd were away, I was still outside, nobody had appeared, something wrong here. So I walked back in, and all I could see was photographers running to one corner. I said to one of them, what's wrong? And I got told then that the barrier collapsed.
I was, along with another 3 of my colleagues, right at the foot of the corner of the ground, the northeast corner, immediately below passageway 13. We could see up towards the top of the terrace and the white hankies being waved, and that was a sign that the assistance, or first aid assistance, or police assistance was required. Even before we got to the top of the walkway, there was people, you know, just looking absolutely bewildered. Some of them had injuries, upper limb injuries, cuts to their head, and wandering about really in a daze. But once you got to the top of the stairway and looked down, it was just a seething mass of people, bodies lying all entangled with each other, shoes, scarves, tammies, bonnets, personal clothing, just lying in heaps.
Just a mangled mass of metal and bodies everywhere. People were running about, milling about. And all you could do is just try and get on with it, help as much as you could.
Oh God, you couldn't even describe it. There were people who were actually crying over their friends. You know, there's some people, and I even asked them. I said, "Look, why this boy's dead helped somewhere else, trying to get their mind off it. But it was of no avail at all. These boys had been, their friends were dead. Some, as I say, were injured. The police were doing their best. And actually everybody there, I would say that everybody there helped in some way.
We concentrated on getting the walking wounded cleared away to the first aid post that has been set up inside the stadium, and then finally assisting with the removal or retrieval of the bodies. If you look down one way down the stairs, it was still this just massive crushed and twisted metal with all the personal effects lying. And if you turned and looked across the pitch, and by this time there was a mist had come down and it was terribly, terribly cold. But it was like dominoes stacked across the perimeter of the touchline, with bodies in stretchers, bodies with coats, jackets, tarpaulins, whatever, all neatly laid in a row.
Across the country, people started to realise what had happened.
It wasn't until we got back to Kincardine where the supporters buses used to stop on the way back. The older boys would go in for the pub for a pint or whatever. It was when they came back out the pub onto the bus, they were telling us, they'd seen on the television there'd been an incident at Ibrox, there had been fatalities at the Rangers end of the ground. And that was the first of us knowing about anything happening at all. As the night went on, we gradually found out that the Markinch boys weren't on the Glenrothes Rangers supporters bus when it got back to Glenrothes. We thought maybe just caught up in a crowd, get a bus train back home into Markinch later on that night. So all that night we were waiting on the buses, trains coming into the town, hoping and hope that they would come off them. Even at midnight, the last train into Markinch.
We were standing on top of the bridge at the station, and I could see in the distance there was a light, you know, off from the train through this sort of misty fog. The train pulls up. The train stopped. The doors opened. One or two people disembarked. The doors closed. You know, after that, it was, I'll never ever forget that feeling. We went home. I don't think we slept that night. Just start to wonder, you know, what has happened.
In Maddiston, the Ferguson family were suffering the agony of the same anxious wait. Their Margaret did not come home that night either.
We had no idea. I went home and never slept all night. I had that feeling something was bad. The next morning, I got up early and went down the stairs, and I get the papers delivered, and I get this Sunday Post, and just as it was pushed through the door, all I seen was this wee caption, and it said, 2 boys from Calderwood and 1 from Manchester had picked up a young girl at 18, carried her across the park into the dressing rooms, but they couldn't save her. Then I knew that everything that I had thought had happened.
I can't remember how I found out, who told me, but the word had started to filter through that the 5 Markinch boys had perished at Ibrox. was stunned, numb. Just found it unbelievable that that could happen. That was it. We were just, it was just numbness. It was like we can't believe this has happened. You know, 5 boys, our pals that, you know, all lived together. You know, we played football together. We're never ever going to see them again, you know.
32 of the 66 supporters who died were teenagers. 5 of them live within 100 yards of each other in this town, in this street, which today mirrors the grief of Scotland.
As a young boy myself, you know, it was pretty hard to comprehend that. I'd never experienced tragedy or bereavement or anything like that in my life. And so yes, it was just a complete feeling of just numbness. You know, I can't even recall crying because we're just too numb to actually shed any tears.
It would be days before the Fergusons found out exactly what happened to Margaret.
The 2 boys came to visit my mum and dad, the 2 fae Calder crews. I never ever found out what their names were. And they said that their mate had written it way back to Manchester and said that he would never be back at another football match. And seemingly, but the boy that was with her, as she left the match, she left before the final score, before the final goal. And they were on their way down the staircase, he says, and people were pushing to the back, but people were stopped in front of them. And he said that he had a hold of her hand and he was falling, so he let go of her hand. And then he woke up at the side of a barrier.
Those who had made it out and home to their loved ones began processing what had happened to them.
I didn't have any serious injuries, and it wasn't until the following morning when I woke up that you know, I found bruising on my body, especially around the top of my legs, where I'd been crushed. But other than that, I walked away unscathed. I was extremely lucky.
Small in my back was crushed and bruised. My shoulders were crushed. Were bruised and all that. So it was basically just badly bruising.
This is Jim recovering in hospital. Just 14, he had devastating news to deal with. Rab McAdam, the man who used to take him to matches, had not come home.
I reckon it was maybe about 6 days after it I found out Big Rab was dead. I didn't ken, and when I was in the hospital I didn't ken Big Rab was dead. I was asking for him what was happening, and it was my father eventually told me when I got home to the house.
So were they keeping that from you then, while you were in hospital?
Aye, because I don't think they knew what to do.
Following days, everybody says I was very quiet and ashen. I was had a grey complexion, and seemingly I had that for weeks. I went back to work, whatever day it was, the Monday or Tuesday, and carried on.
The scale of the disaster was shocking. 66 dead and 145 injured. Scotland was stunned.
Lord Provost, what would you like to say at the moment on behalf of the city?
Well, it's very difficult to put into words how I feel, because it's a tremendous tragedy. We had a very happy festival indeed of football, and everyone, to my mind, was all going home reasonably happy at the result. And this to have hit our city today is, to me, words fail me, and to go over there and see the tragedy of this and the sight of these poor people who were out for a good day's sport and, as I say, the festival of football, and to realise that tonight there are so many sad homes in Glasgow. Really, words fail me.
There won't be a requiem mass in the cathedral in Clyde Street. The Rangers Football Club will be in attendance, as many of them as possible, members of the board of directors and playing staff and personnel.
He will make his home among them. They shall be his people, and he will be their God. His name is God with them. He will wipe away all tears from their eyes. There will be no more death and no more mourning or sadness. The world of the past has gone.
Rangers players and management attended nearly every funeral. Reporters and camera crews from across the world descended on Markinch. But the town paid tribute to its 5 lost sons in its own quiet way.
The atmosphere was, as one would expect, it was heartbreaking to be there and seeing the families, seeing the mums, the dads, the grannies, the granddads, and the siblings as well. Seeing them all and knowing that there was nothing you could do which was going to make any difference to them. And I mean, it was a very moving experience, something you wouldn't want anybody to go through. And the congregation was touched by silence, I think you would say. I don't know how the minister managed it, to be honest. I don't think I'm able to describe how it must have been going back to school and discovering that there were people that you'd been at school, been in class with 2 weeks ago. You come back after the Christmas holidays and they're not there, and you know they're not coming back.
The 5, Peter Easton, Brian Todd, Ronald Payton, Douglas Morrison, and Mason Phillip are remembered here still.
In the church we have a memorial Bible which has the names of the 5 boys marked in it and is dedicated to their memory. It's at the children's window. And in the churchyard we have a memorial bench which was donated through the good offices of the local Rangers Supporters Memorial Committee, but with worldwide donations. And it sits in the churchyard facing over to the cemetery where 3 of the boys are buried.
The town also remembers the boys with this memorial at the end of the street where they lived.
Well, I actually see the memorial every day in life with staying just round the corner, so it's a constant memory reminder to me about what happened. And from time to time I give it a clean up, I wash it down, tidy up round about the trees, and so.
Margaret Ferguson was buried in her local cemetery.
The day of her funeral, my dad, I remember him standing in the hall and he says, right, I want your opinion. He says, I don't want her mum to see her the way she is. So what do you think? Should I get the casket closed? And I stepped out the kitchen and I says, Dad, you're the head of your family. You decide. It was sealed.
Did she protest about that? Was she okay?
She could never accept. She always used to say, no, she's not there. My mum went downhill after that.
It's hard to live with the shadow of the Ibrox disaster over you. I've lived with it for 50 years, I mean, it's a hard thing to live with. And you think it would get easier each year as it comes by, but it doesn't. It gets harder and harder each year. I think as you get older. It's important that people remember what happened. It was a disaster. It affected so many families and so many people's lives, and it's part of history.
The clubs had to try picking themselves up and carrying on. Just 2 weeks after the tragedy, Rangers hosted Dundee United at Ibrox.
There was a deathly hush, obviously, about the place. You know, that going into it, you thought it was maybe like a friendly you're playing, a pre-season game. It was very quiet and quite strange. And I never went up the Copeland Road. I entered the terracing from this end, the Broomlawn end, and I stood at the edge of the shed at the Broomlawn end of the ground.
The shadow of the Ibrox disaster hung over the survivors, the bereaved, and the club itself. Questions about the safety of Stairway 13 began immediately after the accident. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened there. 10 years earlier, 2 people had died and 45 were injured in a crush on the same stairway. As a result of this, barriers were constructed either side of the stairs. In 1967, a supporter lost his footing on the stairway and 11 people were hurt. And on 2nd of January 1969, another stumble led to 30 people being injured.
Is there going to be an official public inquiry?
There must be. There must be.
All of these were Old Firm matches, which drew the biggest crowds in Scotland. Why, after all this, was little done to prevent the 1971 incident?
You cannot judge an event in 1971 by the science that we know and understand now. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. We all got 20/20 vision when we look back on something. But at that time, this was common practice. There hadn't been a disaster.
One of the families has described it as a disaster waiting to happen. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. But that's only with the benefit of hindsight, of knowing what we know now.
The fatal accident inquiry took place within weeks. It confirmed the 66 died from being crushed. Some were trapped under the bodies of other victims. The evidence suggested that it had started when 1 or 2 people fell or collapsed on the stairway. The jury rejected claims that fans rushing back up the stairs had caused the tragedy and called for improved safety measures at football grounds. Rangers were cleared of any blame for the disaster.
I think it was an accident that could have happened anywhere on any of the grounds in Great Britain at that time. It was just an accident. I don't think you can point the finger at Rangers, put it that way.
There had been other incidents on that specific stairway though?
Yeah, in 61, there was 2 boys died. But I can't see, you know, it was the normal grounds. Goodness, you go to Brockville and you go to Tynecastle, try and get out of these places, it was just as bad. It was just a situation, that's the way that the grounds were built in those days.
I didn't attach any blame. I'd seen the pictures in the newspapers of Stairway 13 and the tangled railings, but I wasn't at that point going to apportion blame to anybody. It was a tragic accident.
I think there was certainly at the time an atmosphere of complacency among not just clubs but the national bodies, the SFA and others as well, about football safety at grounds, because it had been well known that there were incidents at grounds, especially on stairways, you know, at the end of matches when people were exiting. Nothing very much was really done.
In 1974, a civil test case was brought by one of the Ibrox widows at Glasgow Sheriff Court. Much of the paperwork relating to the case is held here at the city's Mitchell Library. The documents are fascinating. An engineering report written for the claimant criticised the club for reinforcing the wooden fence with concrete after the 1961 incident, as this cut off an escape route. The report also claimed the height and depth of the steps were unsafe in some parts of Stairway 13. Although the FAI had cleared the fans of any blame, the engineer for Rangers insurers said the spectators created their own danger. And he wasn't alone in suggesting this.
Here's a submission from the then Rangers director, George Brown. He says that the 1967 and 69 accidents on Stairway 13 were not considered pointers to any particular danger. He goes on to say, "It seemed to us to be a good staircase. That it was of the wrong design was a novel conception. Not one official voice was heard to say so." He adds, "I could only consider that the crowd must have been indulging in some form of barging and shoving." He then goes on to say, "The accidents on the staircase could have been created by elements in the crowd simply refusing to hold back and maintain some form of order amongst themselves." That was a Rangers director saying that.
Nearly every instance is blame the crowd. Crowd behave like animals, panic stampede. If you look at all of the headlines of all of the major disasters, they'll usually use those two words, panic and stampede. Very rarely has that been the cause of the incident. It's been a consequence of people reacting to a situation that they find themselves. I could be seriously injured here, therefore I'll react. An adrenaline, a fight or flight response to it.
The sheriff who presided over the civil case found that the disaster was down to Rangers' negligence. He criticised the club for its lack of record-keeping on safety meetings and planning in the wake of the other incidents over the decade leading up to 1971. He said the club acted as though they had hoped the problem would disappear. His ruling led to payouts for the bereaved and injured.
Sheriff Irvin Smith later wrote in his autobiography that this made him deeply unpopular amongst his Rangers supporting friends. But it wasn't, Rangers weren't sued in the way they would be now. There wasn't a class action that could have bankrupted the club at that stage of its proceedings.
In the immediate aftermath of the accident, the government commissioned the Scottish judge Lord Wheatley to investigate safety at Britain's sports grounds. His report was published in 1972 and became the basis for new laws on spectator safety across the UK. Ibrox was entirely rebuilt by 1981. That was due to one man, the manager at the time of the disaster, Willie Waddell.
Now, Willie Waddell's an extraordinary figure in the Ibrox story because he realises from the beginning, from the moment that the consequences of the disaster become clear, that Ibrox Park is not a sustainable football ground. It just can't afford to have any more safety lapses. He went and looked at other stadiums, and the stadium that Ibrox is principally based on is Borussia Dortmund's Westfalenstadion in Germany. And so it was a much more regulated structure. And the ground was broken up into stands that were much more easily policed and handled in general. It was a foresight of what was to come in British football generally.
Many Rangers fans say the modern Ibrox is the lasting memorial to the victims of the disaster. And since 2001, a statue of former captain John Greig has stood marking the accident. For those who lived through or lost at Ibrox 50 years ago, this remembrance is important.
It's a reminder of how unsafe football grounds were at the time and how much more safe they are nowadays. And I think other fans are generally as well very sympathetic to what happened, because anyone who attended big games in those days at Hampden, Celtic Park or Ibrox knew exactly what the crowd conditions were like and could sympathise, I'm sure, with how the fans felt on that day.
We need to keep it fresh every year, so that the generations growing up know exactly what the disaster was.
Not to let it happen again.
The older generation, I class myself amongst that now in Mark Inch, we'll never ever forget that, because it was the most tragic day, in the history of the town. Memories fade, but they'll never fade in my mind. That day that's always with me. I'll never forget that.